Just put the story and you can evaluate for yourself whether it's true or not. The next slide. This is my book, which is just released, and if I'd known it was going to do as well as it did, I would have spent more time on it because it was an update from an old book. I'll talk a little bit about it during the presentation, but it's done fairly well. Go to the next slide. This is the UFO. This is what got me started in 1975. Next slide. This was called Charlie Red Star. You can't see that one. It's sort of a triangle that's sort of moving along. You can sort of see a time exposure. Okay. There's sort of a time exposure. Next slide. These are lights that appeared on the ground in 1976. I actually got close enough to one of these things I was going to jump on it. Next slide. When it happened was my first sighting took place about 2 weeks after the end of the Vietnam War. These are all the Minuteman III missile silos in North Dakota that were ready to be launched against the Russians, and the interpretation we had was because the Americans were thinking about launching the missiles, because it was the domino theory. Everybody was trying to figure out, South Vietnam's gone, is South Korea going next, where are the communists going to go next? They're going to try to get Philippines. What we think happened was that people were thinking about using the weapons, and the aliens picked this up, and we were just north of the border there, above the Grand Forks missile range, and we had piles of sightings, and in 1976, it was like the CIA took the drugs out of the water. It just gone. And I had 100 sightings. The guy who ran the airport there had 150 sightings. I asked the other guy, I said, how many sightings have you had in Carmen? He lives there. How many sightings have you had since 1976? None. 150 sightings in a year and a half, and it just disappeared. As soon as these missile things sort of calmed down. Next slide. This is the White House statement that I referred to in my presentation, and that's what I'm sort of going to do is update my presentation. This is the official White House statement that was put out by the Obama administration last year. The U.S. government has no evidence that any life exists outside of our planet or that extraterrestrial presence has contacted or engaged any member of the human race. In addition, there is no credible information to suggest that any evidence is being withheld from the public. Now, I mentioned it briefly in my presentation, I filed about 8 FOIAs on this. What I can tell you is one of the FOIAs said, I want all the evidence that shows that President Obama or anybody in his office saw the petition. No documents. He never saw the petition. The other thing I asked was, I said, I want to see all the documentation that was used to write this statement, whatever letters, whatever books were used, no evidence. The guy who wrote it was a public relations officer out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the science advisor. He was a public relations guy. The next day he was writing some article about some factory or something. I mean, this is what the level of this is. It's absolutely just a total waste of time. The president never saw it. And I say it's bad because Steve Bassett got 12,000 signatures to this petition. Gone are the days. I remember when I had at the Nixon library, when I got the Nixon files, some girl sent Nixon a letter on UFOs, and Nixon actually returned the letter and sent her a book. Now you can get 12,000 signatures as Steve Bassett did, and the president isn't even going to look at the letter. Now, because that happened, they moved the number of signatures you needed to 25,000. Then someone filed a petition on the U.S. government building a Death Star, and they didn't want to answer that one. They figured, well, now we're going to move it up. So now it's 100,000 signatures that you need on a petition to get the president to answer your letter or your concern, which, as a Canadian, I think this is pretty bizarre that you can't write a letter to the president and expect to get an answer if you've got 100,000 signatures. And when you do get an answer, as Steve Bassett did, they're just going to walk around and give you a public relations guy who's just going to make up something and throw it out there. Next slide. My lecture is sort of on the Rockefeller Initiative. That's what Steve wanted me to do, and the president's. But I want to talk about the best evidence, because I've got some evidence, and what I want to do is to try to get you the best evidence, because that's what happened to me. I had my sightings. I knew what I saw. I knew it was probably extraterrestrial. It was very weird. And I just wanted to find out who knew the answer to this. So I'm busy. That's all I've been doing, is to try to figure out who knows what's going on. And I want to try to get as much of that information to people around me, because I know you're probably looking for the same answer I have. So this was the Rockefeller Initiative. This was when Lawrence Rockefeller went to President Clinton, and they put out a document called the Best Available Evidence document. And what Rockefeller was doing is taking the best evidence he could, and he was putting it out there, and he sent it to 1,000 people. Billy Graham got a copy, Kissinger got a copy, Bill and Hillary Clinton got a copy, all sorts of ambassadors got copies. Next slide. These are some of the documents I'll be talking about tomorrow. This is a critical document. You really can't read this, but I'll be talking about the document section tomorrow. This is a very critical document I'm going to talk about tomorrow that comes out of Canada. The Canadians shut down their UFO program about the same time the Americans did. You'll hear these stories that the Canadians are declassifying stuff. They're not declassifying anything. They did exactly the same thing as the Americans in the late 60s. They shut the program down, and they have not done anything since. They're playing the same game. There's no ETs. There's no evidence. This is an important document out of 1969. What happened in Canada, there was a number of different agencies that were involved. There was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were involved, the Defense Department was involved, and the Department of Transport was the key one that was involved. When they shut the program down, all the documents were moved to the National Research Council in Canada. This is a letter written from the Defense Department to the National Research Council in 1969, and basically what they say, next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, it talks about in the middle paragraph here, it basically says that the Department of Transport has sent files. Attached to all these files is Project Magnet. Project Magnet is the key study that was done in Canada. It was done by the Department of Transport. What this says is that you will see that Project Magnet is attached to this report. So all the files from Project Magnet are coming, and what he says is that inside is the confidential discussions inside the Department of Transport, and he said, it says, at no time should this be made available to the public. So basically what you have is a guy saying that this stuff is here, and what I say is going on is they'll release the sighting files. They could not care less. You get the little sightings, what's going on, they don't care about that. The discussion inside, like with the Prime Minister, with the President, with the top military people, you're never going to see that. All you're going to see is the sighting files. So here it says, at no time should this file that talks about the internal discussions that are going on, no time should be made available to the public. Next slide. At the very end of the document, the last paragraph says, this file should be destroyed, but not be destroyed until the subject of UFOs has cooled off. So the internal discussion is supposed to be destroyed. Next slide. This is one of the ones they missed. And Stanton Friedman, I think he's still here, Stanton had a big part in this. You'll see his name on the bottom of this document. Stanton had a big part in pushing this out in about 1978. And what this is called the top secret. We call it the top secret memo. This is a memo that was written in Canada. This is page 1 of it. Let's go to page 2. Next slide. Page 2, this is an important one. And for a number of years, I've talked about this. Stanton has talked about this. This is one of the few top secret documents in UFOs that is not disputed by the government. The Canadian government does not dispute this is a real document. It's in their archives. They produced this document. And what the document says on page 2 is this. He says, and this what happened is the Canadians went to the Americans. In 1950, this is November of 1950, they want to find out if the flying saucer thing is real. They go to the Americans, they go through the military attaché at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the military attaché goes to the American military and says, what's the deal? They gather the material together. The material is put in this final report, this top secret report that goes to the Canadian government. Point number 1, the matter is considered is the most highly classified subject in the United States. It's rated higher even than the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb would not be detonated. The first test would not be done until 2 years after this document was written. Number 2, flying saucers exist. The American officials told the Canadians flying saucers exist. They've been playing a game ever since. The modus operandi is unknown, but there's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the science advisor to President Roosevelt. So they say that Vannevar Bush is running the organization that is in control of flying saucers, trying to figure out what's going on. The entire matter is considered to be of tremendous significance. That's the 4th part. What I'm going to add now, and I can't get into it tonight, if you see my consciousness lecture, I talk about the importance of consciousness to this phenomena. Where it comes from is the very next line in this document. I had an inspiration last year at Phoenix. I saw a lecture. Everything's 35 years of material all just suddenly came together in my head, and I suddenly realized what the significant key to this whole thing is, and it's consciousness. The next line says, I was further informed by American officials, not guys on the street, not little people who have seen flying saucers, by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. and that the Americans aren't doing very well because they have said to us that if we have anything, they're willing to exchange credentials and talk to us about this mental phenomena thing. So in 1950, the Canadians were told by the Americans that mental phenomena was associated with the saucers. The reason that is so important is because Betty and Barney Hill, their book would not become public till 16 years later. The first contactees who talked about interacting with aliens did not come out until November of 1952. 2 years before, the Canadians and the Americans knew that mental phenomena was a key part of this mystery. Now, what came to my head last year, and this is my short consciousness lecture, things that had happened that people had said suddenly made sense. One of the things happened, and this is in the book that we've just released, Dr. Eric Walker. We get this guy, Dr. Eric Walker, from Penn State University. He's got 14 honorary doctorate degrees. He was chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, which is the major military think tank in the United States. He was chairman of the National Science Foundation. He was executive secretary of the Research and Development Board, which was in charge in 1950, at the time when this memo was written, of all the weapons in the United States of America. He was president of Penn State University, the Ivy League Engineering College, for 15 years. He confirmed to us in the first interview he was at a set of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So what happens is we get a series of researchers, about 6 or 7 researchers, who chase him around for 8 years trying to get him to talk. And in one of the interviews, we're trying to get him to talk about, Stanton was talking about MJ-12. We're trying to get him to confirm, MJ-12, how many people are on the group? Is it all Americans? What's going on? And suddenly he cuts us off and he says, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And the guy that was interviewing him from Britain really didn't have an answer. I don't even remember what the answer was. He had no answer. And Walker answered his own question. He said, look, unless you understand about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in. And he's referring to the MJ-12 group. You will not be taken in. Very few people understand how it works. So in 1950, the Canadians were told that mental phenomena was involved. In 1991, in an interview, Dr. Eric Walker tells us that ESP is the key to the whole thing. And then in 1993, Ben Rich is giving a lecture at UCLA to the graduating alumni for engineering, and is in there. Everybody knows the first part of the story. He shows the slide. The last slide he shows is a flying saucer, and he says, we now have the technology to take ET home. We've discovered the mistake in the equation. It's going to take an act of God to get this thing out of Congress because it's so deep black. 2 of the people in the room are Keller and Jan Harzen. And Jan Harzen, they race after him. They realize this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Here's the guy who runs Skunkworks, Black Ops, Stealth, all the U-2, SR-71. This is the top guy. And he's saying this is for real. They chase him out of the room. Jan Hartson says to him, look, let me ask you a question. What do you mean you've discovered the mistake in the equation? What are you talking about? I'm interested in UFO propulsion. How do the UFOs get here? And Ben Rich is heading for the car. Ben Rich turns around and says exactly what Walker had said 2 years before. He says, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And Jan Hartson says, well, that just means everything in time and space is connected. And he said, that's how it works. And he gets in his car and he drives off. And if you go to my consciousness lecture, I'll tell you the whole what happened for the rest of the year, all these synchronicity things that people started coming up to me and telling me they're flying the flying saucer and how they fly the flying saucer. And it's just like unbelievable. It just all suddenly made sense. Next slide. So we're going to leave that part. Here's another document I'm going to talk about tomorrow. This is a report that was the Project Magnet report. As I said, the Department of Transport was the main unit that was doing the real UFO, the flying saucer. They never called it UFOs. Always called it flying saucers, even after the term UFO came in, because I think Wilbur Smith, who was running the program, knew that the term UFO was just there to muddy the waters. He always called them flying saucers, flying discs. He never called them UFOs. This is his report that sat on the Prime Minister's desk, according to his wife, sat on the Prime Minister's desk for 3 months. At that point, Wilbur and the Prime Minister of Canada decided that the time really wasn't right. This is 1952. Next page of the document. Can we go next slide? This is the first page. But before, let me remind you, there's no proof of extraterrestrials. There's no evidence. There's no cover-up. Okay, next slide. In the top, in this document, and I'll read it. I'll get my glasses on here. It says, this is an official Canadian report that sat on the Prime Minister's desk. It appears then that we are faced with a substantial possibility of the real existence of extraterrestrial vehicles, regardless of whether or not they fit into our scheme of things. So the Canadians basically said, yeah, this is for real. It's probably extraterrestrial, it's for real. Next slide. Wilbur Smith ran in Ottawa, the Canadian capital. He ran, at the bottom here, you'll see the Flying Saucer Observatory. This was an observatory that they set up to detect flying saucers. On August the 8th, 1954, they had 5 different instruments. I talked to somebody who was actually in the room when it happened. The bells went off, they went running out, and they went on record. Wilbur Smith said, unless there's something wrong with the equipment, we've detected the first flying saucer over the nation's capital. Not a good move. 2 days later, they shut the program down. Next slide. This is the flying saucer station shut down, but something still a mystery. Next slide. This is the Canadian Embassy. This is where all the communication went on between the Canadians and the Americans, was at the Canadian Embassy here in Washington. Next slide. This is the Canadian Embassy document. When it said in there the fact that these documents, these internal documents with discussions were to be destroyed, they destroyed these documents. These we found in Smith's personal files. These are actual documents from the Canadian Embassy to Wilbur Smith and back and forth. Next slide, I'll discuss. So here's the third ambassador in the Canadian Embassy writing to Wilbur Smith. There's very little more that can be done here for the present. The official position here, he's talking about Washington, D.C., is still that nobody knows anything. The matter, none knows anything here about the matter at all. We are, of course, keeping our ears and eyes open, and if anything does come down, you will probably hear it through the Wright and Salant channel. These are the military liaison guys who are trying to figure out what's going on in Washington. Next slide. Oh yeah, and on that slide it says, nobody outside of Wright, who's the military attaché, and myself, we've got orders from the ambassador that nobody is to talk about the subject. So there's a clearance. On the second page, they refer at the top here, they say the article, Wilbur Smith, the Canadians actually send an article on UFO propulsion to Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush is the guy that's running the American program. So at the top of this document, an official document, it says the article was returned to Kehoe through Wright, who's the military attaché, and he has not heard anything since from Bush or what Bush thought. So they've sent this article to Vannevar Bush, and they're waiting for the article to come back. Now these documents, I guess they managed to destroy all these documents. Next slide. The ambassador and I would be particularly interested in any indication that you may have heard when you were here, they're talking to Smith in Washington, on the possibility of an official U.S. government statement. The Canadians are basically told, yes, there was a crash flying saucer, it went down, this thing's for real, all we know is we didn't build them, we're working on it. So the Canadians in this document are actually sitting there in 1950, late 1950, waiting for the American government to make a disclosure, to announce the fact they've got a crash flying saucer. Now, of course, it doesn't happen, but the Canadians think the statement's coming. They're sitting there on edge waiting for this to happen. Next slide. This is a story, we may not get much into this. This is Francis Swan, this is an FBI document. I think it's an FBI document. FBI investigated her, the CIA investigated her, Navy intelligence investigated her, the Canadians investigated her. She lived just down the road from Betty Hill, had an interaction with Betty Hill, haven't got time to tell the story. But she was in contact with aliens, and she actually taught the CIA how to channel aliens. And there's an incident that occurs in July of 1959 where the CIA, the head UFO guy in the CIA, and 2 Navy intelligence officers actually channel an alien, and the thing flies by the window. And we've got the documents and stuff. So this woman was very important in this early history of trying with the Americans and the Canadians figuring out what's going on. Next slide. This is an incident that involved Mrs. Swan, and this is an incident that Paul Hellyer first announced in 1967, and Paul didn't even know. He wasn't even interested in UFOs at the time. He said he saw UFO stuff when he was Secretary of Defense in Canada coming across. And what happens in 1967, in July, we have a centennial project. So it's the 100th anniversary of Canada. Paul Hellyer is running around the country as Secretary of Defense, and he's opening projects, different projects. And the town of St. Paul, Alberta, decides they're going to have a UFO landing base. They're going to build a UFO landing base, and this is going to be a tourist attraction. And Paul Hellyer goes there to open this thing in 1967. He writes, he gives in the speech, he says, well, this isn't the first time we've had a landing base. He said, we actually had one 13 years ago. There was a top secret committee, and we opened a base called Suffield, which is the Canadian equivalent of Area 51. It's a top secret Army base in Alberta, Suffield, Alberta, no flyovers. And Paul says, well, in this speech, open speech, covered in every newspaper in Canada, that the Canadians actually opened the base for UFOs to land, which sent me and another researcher after Paul Heller for a number of years and saying, well, how do the aliens know where to go? Part of the story is missing. And what it was Francis Swan, Wilbur Smith, all these people had said to the Canadian government, if you quit trying to shoot it down, we'll land it. So the Canadians have actually admitted that they opened a base, and they say a small inside group was putting pressure on them. And we know who the group was, we know the whole story, and this was the base they opened for UFOs to land in Canada. This is 1954, the same year that Eisenhower was rumored to have met with the aliens, the same year that Horsley, in the United Kingdom, the guy who's in control of the nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom, tells a story in his autobiography years later that he was visited by an alien in 1954 and told to stop the nuclear weapons, and he wanted to meet with Prince Philip. And 54 is an important year, but the Canadians did open a base, and they admit it, it's on the record now, that they opened a base for UFOs to land in 1954. Next slide. This is Goldwater. I mentioned these if you've seen my stuff. If people think there's no cover-up, there's no evidence. This is Barry Goldwater, who for 4 years was chairman of the Intelligence Committee for the Senate. He was the top guy. Let's go to the slides. We'll just go through some of the stuff he wrote. I went to Arizona and recovered all his files. He wrote a lot of UFO letters. They're on my website, 150 pages of UFO letters, whatever. And here's what he says. I made an effort to find out what was inside the building at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and I was understandably denied this request. It is still classified above top secret. There's a secret. There's a cover-up. Barry Goldwater said it is classified above top secret. Next slide. Here he is. Now he's intelligence. He's running the intelligence for Senate right now. This is what he said in a letter as the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Relative to your question about the accuracy of the details in the Roswell incident, which was the book that Stanton was talking about that was released in 1980, as to the details, they are partly true, but not completely. I can't give you any other answer, so don't push it. Next slide. As chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he says this thing has gotten so highly classified, it is simply impossible to get anything on it. And he's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Next slide. Here as Senate Intelligence Committee, he says, I have no idea who controls the flow of need to know, because frankly, I was told in such an emphatic way that it was none of my business, that I've never tried to make it my business since. Next slide. Here again, Senate Intelligence Committee. I have been interested in this subject for a long time, and I do know that whatever the Air Force has on the subject is going to remain highly classified. And that is, despite what the Obama White House is now saying, no cover-up, Goldwater says absolutely ain't true. Next slide. This is a thing, I'll just do this quickly. This is a documentary that was produced in the early 1970s. I mentioned it very briefly in my testimony the other day. This is a documentary. The government says we aren't involved in UFOs. No, haven't been involved in UFOs. Got out of the program in 1969 with Project Blue Book. This happened about 1973. If this was true, if they had gotten out of UFOs in 1969, they would have just shut up and done nothing, and the story would have gone away. That's not what happened. If they were not involved, if there was nothing to it, then why in 1973, when the fire was about to go out, did they go and throw gas on the fire? They started it all up. They hired, it's called UFOs It Has Begun. You can find this on the internet. If you Google search this, you will see the 1979 remake. The original one was 1974. It was called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. Next slide. Two producers, Bob Emenegger and Alan Sandler, go to the Pentagon. They do not sign in at the Pentagon. They go and visit this man, who's Bill Coleman, who is the public relations officer for the Blue Book program. They say, on the record numerous times, we signed an actual contract, a movie contract with the Pentagon to make a UFO documentary. So if you're out of UFOs in 1969, why in 1973 are you taking two guys and doing a UFO documentary? They wanted stuff out. Next slide. They're given $250,000 to do this documentary. In the credits, they're told, and the guy that put the money up was MacArthur, the MacArthur Foundation that does all the PBS stuff. John MacArthur, they said, well, Mr. MacArthur, he's having some trouble with some of his friends. He'd rather not have you put his name in the credits. But keep the money. Don't worry about the money. Just don't put his name in the credits. So they get $250,000 to do this documentary, which nobody even knows where the money comes from, but the story has been told where it is. Next slide. They're given a number of films. One of the films is the Holloman Air Force Base film. And they actually put 8 seconds of the film. Now, this may work, it may not. We may not be linked here. But here's the 8 seconds. Go to the next slide. This is the 8 seconds they actually put in. No. Okay. Go back one slide. Okay, this is, you can see the mountains here, and basically what it is they're allowed to put 8 seconds. In the end, what happens is they're allowed the film. They actually have the film in their possession. It shows 3 different views of a UFO landing. The aliens get out. They're greeted by officials at Holloman Air Force Base. They actually have the film in their possession. Just before the film is to be released, Coleman says, we need the film back. It's Watergate. Time isn't right. We can't release the film. You have to use storyboard. You've got to draw the thing. You can't use the documentary. But they allow them to put 8 seconds of the film into the documentary, which is very, I won't get into, I know why they did it, but they're allowed to use 8 seconds. Okay, go to the next one. This is one that I talked in. Stanton was kind of surprised. I talked about this in the testimony. The government says there's no cover-up. Government says there's no evidence. Bob told me categorically, he said a number of times, we've got on a number of taped interviews where he said that they were given a bunch of films. NASA, and in fact, in the credits, you'll see they thank the NASA and they thank the Department of Defense for their cooperation on the documentary. They're given a pile of film, including the Holloman film, which is pulled back. They show a bunch of films from NASA, slides from NASA. This is one that they get. It's a launch at Vandenberg Air Force Base. The film shows the downrange, missile going downrange, and 2 UFOs tracking this object. They get the guy who does all the analysis for Blue Book and for the Robertson panel in the 1950s, an expert, to look at it, and the guy says, no, this is UFO. This is not illusion, this is UFO. They've got the film. I said to Bob, so what happened to the film? Did you give it back? He said, no, I think we still got it. I said, what is it? He said, it's top secret. I said, so you got a top secret film that the government gave you, and you didn't give it back? And he said, no. I said, I think Alan's got it in his vault in Oregon. And I said, well, holy cow. He said, yeah, it's got Quintanella's name. The Blue Book commander, it's got Quintanella's name on it. It's got top secret, and I think we still got it. And he checked with Alan, yeah, they still got it. Now, James Fox is trying to get it. James Fox says this is the smoking gun, and they learned it from me that this film was there. It is a smoking gun. James Fox is trying to get this film. So you may actually see this film come up. There's some negotiation as to getting this film. But this was the fact that shows that this stuff about there's no cover-up is total nonsense. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to do a little bit of Rockefeller Initiative. This is Lawrence Rockefeller meeting with the president. Lawrence Rockefeller, of course, was a billionaire. He was the guy that was the humanitarian, had the philosophy degree from Princeton. His brother, David, ran the money thing. Nelson ran for president, and he was the humanitarian guy, the ecology and all this kind of stuff. And he was interested in UFOs. Next slide. Here's Lawrence Rockefeller. I guess I should maybe tell you, because Peniston talked about this today, that he actually was involved with, no, I'll leave that for later. Lawrence Rockefeller, here's Lawrence Rockefeller with Mr. Cheney, Dick Cheney, and so we'll go to the next slide. Again, I want to remind you what the White House statement is. There's no cover-up. There's no evidence of ETs. Now I'm going to play, you've probably all heard it, my question to Dick Cheney, April of 2001, Diana Rehm show here in Washington, D.C., I asked him, and this is the question you want to ask if you get a high-ranking guy. You don't want to ask, what do you think about UFOs? You don't want to ask, have you had a UFO sighting? You could care less. You ask him, have you been briefed? Here's me asking Dick Cheney, you evaluate yourself, is there a cover-up? Here's the next slide, here's Dick Cheney answering the question. Oh, it's not going to link. Okay, go back, I memorized it. Go back one slide. Okay, I asked him, Mr. Cheney, in all your jobs in government, have you ever been briefed on the subject of UFOs? If so, when was it, and what were you told? And Cheney said, if I had been briefed on that subject, it would probably be classified, and I wouldn't be talking about it. There is a cover-up. Next slide. Okay. This is going back to the Rockefeller Initiative. To give you just a little funny story, Steve Bassett. I've known Steve for a number of years. He was running a thing back many years ago. We were in Laughlin, Nevada. Steve's having a dinner, and at the dinner was John Mack and Bud Hopkins. And Bud Hopkins is sitting right across from me, and we're talking about, because they knew I was into the presidents, they're talking about Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Initiative. And Hopkins and Mack actually stayed at Lawrence Rockefeller's house one weekend, and they said it was kind of weird, you know, he's a billionaire philanthropist guy, and he's asking you what you want for breakfast, you know, he's like a butler. And that was when Rockefeller, this is before Clinton came into office, he said, when the president gets in, it doesn't matter whether it's Bush or whether it's Perot or whether it's Clinton, I'm going to the president, I'm going to get UFOs declassified. I'm going to get it all pulled out. And I still remember Hopkins said, I said to him, you know, Lawrence, I don't think that's how it works. He said, no, that's how it works. I'm going to the president, I'm going to get this thing declassified. So this is a little funny story that this was known before that he was going to go to the president. So go next slide. These are the documents. I'm going to mention this tomorrow. These are the Rockefeller Initiative documents. I got them. I filed an FOIA with the science advisor. I had heard that Bruce Maccabee and other people had gotten documents, so I filed for the same ones. They got 500, I got 1,000 pages. So here's the 1,000 pages of documents. They say there's no cover-up. They say nothing being covered up. Go next slide. That's where the documents are. They're gone. I went to the Clinton Library. I said, you know, I filed an FOIA for all the UFO stuff. They gave me 900 pages. These documents are in there. I said, well, where's the Rockefeller documents? This UFO stuff, and we don't have no record of them. I said, there's 1,000 pages. I sent them the inventory. I said, here's the inventory. Here's the documents, this guy to this guy, and no, we don't have any documents. Go to the National Archives. I went to the National Archives. I said, no, we don't have documents. No documents. I said, what do you mean? I sent them the thing, and I put an appeal in. I said, I'm appealing. Their documents are here. I've got the documents. What do you mean there's no documents? They said, nope, appeal is denied. So what I've decided to do, go next slide, the Clinton Library says they don't have it. They say there's no cover-up. So I've got these documents. I put them on my website. Steve Bassett has them on his website. And I figured, well, you know, they're sort of building up dust at home. I don't know what to do with them. I was thinking maybe I'll give them to the Roswell Museum. I'm trying to figure out who am I gave these documents to. I figure that's what I'm going to do when I get back. I'm going to send them to the Clinton Library. I'm going to say, here's your documents back. I mean, put them in there. Now, what are they going to do? They're just saying these documents don't exist, and they're suddenly going to get there. So you may see on the nightly news, the FBI bomb squad found a bomb outside the Clinton Library, and you're going to see them blow up my little package. You know, they're going to find something to do because I'm sending the documents back. They say their documents don't exist, so here they are. What are they going to do? I don't know what they're going to do with them. Go to the next slide. This is the guy that handled Rockefeller. What happened is Rockefeller went there. He wanted to go to the president, but they wouldn't let him get to the president, so he gets handled by the science advisor to the president. And later on, he does get to the president. Next slide. When Gibbons finds out that Rockefeller's coming, Rockefeller's a powerful guy, so he's figuring, what am I going to do? So he asked for a CIA briefing. He said, I need a briefing on UFOs. And this is the guy that's assigned the briefing at the CIA. His name is Dr. Ronald Pandolfi. And I say, if you really want to know what's going on with UFOs, get his phone number. This is the guy that knows all the answers. But what happens here, in this 1993, Pandolfi works for the CIA. The CIA is not into UFOs. They're publicly not into, so what are you going to do? Rockefeller, this is going to become public that Rockefeller is doing this deal. You can't do a briefing. So what he does, go next slide, he gives the briefing to Bruce Maccabee. Now, Bruce Maccabee's done a couple of lunchtime things at the CIA, knows Ronald Pandolfi, so he gets the task 24 hours before. He said, you got to write a briefing for the president's science advisor. He goes, what do you mean? I got 24 hours. Yeah, you got to write. So Bruce Maccabee spends the whole night. He writes this briefing to the president's science advisor, and what the CIA does is they avoid the issue, because they can't write the briefing, so they give it to Maccabee, but he's just a private citizen. So this is public, what the briefing was, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just like you and I sending something to the White House. Who cares? It's not official. And that's how they got around the briefing. The president asked for a briefing, and they walk around it and get a private citizen to write the briefing. Go ahead. Next slide. This is some of the people that are involved in the Rockefeller Initiative, and Steve made a very good, I won't sort of duplicate this, Steve made a very good presentation the other day. These are the people that come up in the Clinton administration as being very involved in this, trying to get the UFO thing out. John Podesta, who's a very powerful guy when Obama came in, helping Obama set up his White House. John Podesta was very involved. Next slide. This is a key one, Webster Hubbell, and this is where the story comes in. Webster Hubbell said in his book in 1997, he said that he was told by Clinton, if I put you over there in justice, I want you to get the answer to two questions. Number one, who killed JFK? And number two, are there UFOs? So I filed FOIAs on both. The UFO got about 1,000 pages. The Kennedy assassination has about 5,000 to 6,000 pages at the Clinton Library. I don't know if anybody, I haven't looked at them. I don't know if anybody's even looked at the assassination. But Clinton did not believe either story. He did not believe the official story about killing Kennedy, and he didn't believe the official UFO story, so he sent Hubble out there. Now, if you listen to the testimony today, you'll see, and I knew this story before, I didn't release it, but Jim Peniston is doing a story with Larry King. He's in a car with James Fox, and Halt is in the car, and Symington, who's a friend of Clinton. And Symington saved Clinton when he was young from drowning. He's a good friend. He's involved, of course, in the Phoenix Lights. Go to the next one I think we've got here. No, he's involved with the Phoenix Lights, and when they're coming back from the Larry King show, Bill Clinton phones up, and they put him on the speakerphone in the limousine, and he's talking to Symington, and Bill's saying, oh, I watched the show, it's really good, I was watching the whole thing. He said, you know, that's true, you know, he says, I tried to get Hubble to get the answer, and I couldn't get nothing. So Peniston has told the story. I've heard the story before, but Peniston actually confirms the story today that he was there when Bill Clinton was on the speakerphone, and Bill said he couldn't get anything. This is another guy that was involved. He was the Secretary of Energy for Clinton. This is Bill Richardson, who's made a number of pro-UFO statements, and then sort of got in trouble with the Clintons when he sort of backed Obama, so he sort of got pushed to the sidelines. But anyway, next slide. Here's Symington. I've been through that story already. Next slide. Here's an interesting story. Rockefeller, what he would do is he went, of course they don't want to deal with UFOs. It's the last thing you want to do if you're sort of trying to run for political office. And so what they did was they sort of tried to slough him off, and then Rockefeller says, you know, if I don't get cooperation here, I'm going to run an ad in every major newspaper in the United States, and I'm going to ask for disclosure by Bill Clinton. And they go, okay, hang on. And that's why they ran the Roswell report. The GAO was running a Roswell report, but the White House green-lighted the other one. The Air Force doesn't just decide to redo Roswell. They were under pressure to redo Roswell, and that was because they said to him, oh, hang on, don't put the ad in the newspaper. No, it's okay. What do you want me to do? And he said, well, we want you to declassify. And the science advisor said to Rockefeller, he said, well, I mean, if you say this thing is as big as it is and as deep as it is and all this kind of stuff, we can't do it all. He said, just give us one case, we'll declassify the one case, then we'll go after all the rest of the stuff you say is covered up. So Rockefeller says, yeah, okay, we'll do Roswell. And that's why they did the Roswell report. That's why the Air Force went back. They didn't do it on their own. It was because the President and the White House had said, we want you to reinvestigate Roswell, because Rockefeller was pressuring them. Okay, next. So this is what happens. In 1995, they go through the report. The report comes back. They say it's mogul balloon. And then Rockefeller's had enough, and he decides he's going to the President. So they get the President. The President is 1996. He's running for re-election. And it's determined by Dick Morris, his advisor for the 1996 election, that the swing voters, and that's all they care about in elections is swing voters. If you're in a state like Texas or North Dakota, they could care less about you. If you're a swing voter, they're interested in you. So the swing voters in the 1996 election, Dick Morris determined that they were techie people who like to be outside, like to camp, like to fish. That's why Bill Clinton ended up at the Rockefeller Ranch in Wyoming in August of 1995. He could care less. He wanted to be at Hampton golfing with his rich buddies. But he ended up, and Dick Morris talks about this, he was furious being in Wyoming. He's at the Rockefeller Ranch, and Rockefeller says, okay, now is the time. Stephen Greer provides a bunch of documents, and it's called the best available evidence, and Rockefeller sits down with the President and with Hillary Clinton, and he actually briefs them. Again, it's not a briefing, because it's a private citizen. It means nothing. So I file FOIAs, and I get a bunch of pictures from Hillary Clinton. This is one of the pictures we had. She's walking with Lawrence Rockefeller, coming to the ranch, and we noticed two things. One is the book. So we put out a challenge on the internet. What's the book? What book? It has appeared that Rockefeller had given her a book. So it was the book, and then the crosses. Let's go to the next one. I think it shows the crosses. There's the crosses, these bizarre crosses that nobody ever really explained. Hillary's wearing these weird crosses, and we put it around the world, and a lot of people took guesses and tried to compare it to other crosses. She's got these bizarre crosses on. And if you go to my website, you'll see better, clearer pictures of it. And the book. Go to the next one. The book we actually discovered, somebody actually took all the books for 2 years and actually compared the back cover, and they were looking for this eye. And they actually found the book, next slide, and it was a book, it was called Are We Alone? The Philosophical Implications of the Discovery of Extraterrestrial Life. That is the book that Rockefeller gave Hillary Clinton. So he gives them the briefing, and according to what Whitley Strieber heard from Lawrence Rockefeller, the Clintons sat there, didn't say anything, and when it was all over, they didn't say anything. And the next morning, Hillary came up and said to Rockefeller, okay, we've listened to you. Don't ever bring up the subject again. And it all comes down to political. Hillary was intending to run for president. She's going to run for president again, and this is not something you want on your plate. She actually got caught with this channeling of Eleanor Roosevelt, and this kind of stuff you really don't want on your plate. So she basically told Rockefeller, we've listened to you, drop it. Okay, go ahead, next slide. So now we're going to go quickly through the presidents. How much time have I got? I've got almost nothing. Okay, we're going to go through quickly. Harry Truman, go ahead. Next slide. Harry Truman, witnesses reported a Secret Service agent. This comes through Schmidt and Carey. They told me, I said, give me the name of the guy. The guy's name was Gerald McCann. He was swearing people to secrecy on behalf of the President of the United States at Roswell. I went and checked. He's a Secret Service agent. I went and checked the Truman records. What's the chances? Go next one. We discussed this in the testimony. General Landry did between 16 and 20 oral briefings on UFOs. It's not in the record. He says in an oral briefing, he was briefing the president every 3 months on flying saucers. Go ahead, next one. Here's another one. This is where Truman talks on video. He says, yes, we discussed it with at every conference we had with the military. There's no records at the Truman Library. There's no cover-up. There's no evidence. But he says, we discussed it at every conference we had with the military. There was always stuff like that, flying saucers going on. So Truman basically says, yes, they were working on it. Go ahead, next slide. Here's Nixon. Go ahead, this is the Jackie Gleason thing. Next slide. This is Jackie Gleason. This is his second wife. A guy interviewed me did an interview, 2 interviews of her. We tracked her down. He did the interviews. She basically said, yes, this is true. Jackie came back late one night. He was white as a ghost. He was either running around with some woman or he was telling the truth. He said that Nixon took him and showed him the bodies. And Larry Warren has also told the same story to me, and he's on the record as saying he went and shot pool and drank with Gleason at his circular house, and Gleason told him the story of seeing the bodies. Next slide. Ford. Let's play Ford talking about UFOs. Next slide. Oh, you won't have it. No, we have no link. Go ahead. This is the letter that Ford sent to George Filer, who's going to be testifying here. He said, during my public career in Congress as Vice President and President, I made various requests for any information on UFOs. The official authorities always denied the UFO allegations. As a result, I have no information that may be helpful to you. Next slide. There it is. Next slide. Here's Jimmy Carter. This is kind of interesting. Jimmy Carter. We haven't got the links here. Go ahead. Next slide. Here's Danny Sheehan. He talked about it. Danny Sheehan talks about working on 2 studies for Jimmy Carter, one on UFOs, one on extraterrestrials, and the conclusion to the extraterrestrial highly classified report that he saw before it went to the president said there were between 2 and 6 extraterrestrial races in our galaxy. This is the official report that went to the president. Go ahead. Next slide. This is, they're saying no evidence. So here's Danny Sheehan saying he saw an official report that said, yes, there are extraterrestrials. And the president got that report. And he's a pretty reliable guy. Next slide. Here's Shirley MacLaine. Go to the next slide. Here's her talking to the president. This was on the Larry King Show in 1995. He told me many times that when I first wrote out on a limb that he would support me, that it was true. There were occupants. Why should we be the only people in the universe? He wanted to shine the sunshine laws on intelligence to expose it, to see how the people would react, but he didn't and wouldn't and couldn't, as he explained to me. Next slide. She does another one. Next slide. We're not going to link. She does another one where later on she actually campaigns for Jimmy Carter's son, who's running for some political office in Nevada, and she asks him again, what's the deal? And he basically says, I was basically told, you're here for 4 years. There's a lot of people who are here permanently, and basically told to get lost. Next slide. This is Ronald Reagan. This is the old story, and we're not going to link this, but we're missing the audio. Go ahead. This happens that people always say to me, if the president says UFOs are real, I'll believe it. It happened June the 27th, 1981 in the White House Theater. Reagan was sitting there watching E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Next slide. This is just before the thing took place. This is Spielberg, brings the movie to the White House. And Spielberg, next slide, we're not going to have it. Okay. The next slide, what Spielberg says is that at the end of the movie, Reagan got up. He looked around the room like he was doing a head count. And he said, thank you, Stephen, for bringing the movie. We really enjoyed it. And I just wanted you to know that there are a number of the people in this room that know that everything on that screen is absolutely true. And Spielberg said, he said it without a smile on his face. So the president has stood up and said, it's for real. And yet the president now says, it's not for real, there's no evidence. Next slide. I think we'll get to Obama here, and then I think we'll quit. George Bush, if you go to the Bush Library, you'll find no files on UFOs. If you go to my archives, you'll find actual stuff that shows that he did know. Next slide. This is what he says to Charles Huffer, who chased these guys around. What would happen is every time they'd have an election, they would go back to Texas, so they'd stop in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Charles Huffer would be standing there with his tape recorder. When are you going to disclose the UFOs? And he'd get Bush Sr., Bush Jr. He was there for years as these guys flew through going home. And he said to him, he said, are you going to disclose UFOs? And Bush Sr. says, yeah, I'll disclose it. Send us what you got. And Huffer says, what I've got, you're CIA, man. You know what's going on. And that's when we've got it on tape. It's not very clear, but he says, I know some, I know a fair bit. Next slide. This is Dan Quayle, who's the vice president, and you won't have it here. Next slide. He says, we actually spent a lot of time looking at UFOs when he was vice president in the White House. But if you go to the Bush Library, you will find no documents. It's like it's been sanitized. They're all gone. Okay, next slide. Barack Obama. We'll do a Barack Obama, and then we'll call it a night. Barack Obama is the guy who put out the statement. There's no evidence of ETs. There is no cover-up. But as I say, because he never saw the petition, maybe he just forgot, and he goes to Roswell, New Mexico. I think that's the next one. Go ahead, next slide. No, it's, okay, this is the one. And the Sun has actually come out. Jaden Smith has actually come out now and confirmed this story. This is on BBC. This was Will Smith talking about the tour that he did of the White House. And they go through the White House, and Jaden says to his father, he says, I'm going to ask Barack about the aliens. And Will says, no, you're kind of going to embarrass me. No, you're not going to ask him. Yeah, Dad, I want to ask him about the aliens. He said, no, you are not asking the president about the aliens. So they get to and the story is told, they get to the White House Situation Room, they're doing the tour, and there's no mention of aliens, and Jaden says, Mr. President, I'd like to ask you a question. And Obama cuts him off, and he says, I know what you want to ask about. You want to ask about the aliens. And he went, yeah. And he said, I can neither confirm nor deny that ETs have visited the Earth, but if they had, and if there had been a top secret meeting on it, it would have occurred right in this very room. And Jaden goes, yeah, I knew it. So that's the one. I mean, and he's maybe playing around, but he's playing with fire, because eventually some White House reporter is going to get the chutzpah to go and ask him the question, like, what do you mean? And push the issue. So that's the one he does. And the next one is in Roswell, New Mexico. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, he's in Roswell, New Mexico. Next slide, because it's not going to link. We actually have the audio. So in there, he talks about, he's telling a joke. When you go to Roswell, New Mexico, whatever president you are, you have to tell the Roswell joke. So he tells the Roswell joke, and the Roswell joke is, you know, I come in peace. Everybody laughs. He says, you know, the question that's asked me most by people, by 9- and 10-year-old kids, is, Mr. President, what about Roswell? Have you been there? Is it true what they say? And then Obama says, I tell those little kids, you know, if I told you, I'd have to kill you. And he says, oh, you can see the kids, their eyes get all big. And of course, that's his joke. And everybody laughs. And then he pauses. And I've seen enough presidential speeches that I know that this is not in the speech. He pauses after the joke. Everybody laughs. He pauses, and then he says, we'll keep our secrets on this. So he's saying there's no cover-up. And yet, when he goes to Roswell, he talks about Roswell. He says, we'll keep our secrets on this. And the big question ultimately is, what secrets are you talking about? It is secret. They have covered it up. It doesn't matter what the White House statement says. It's true. There's a cover-up, and they know what's going on. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll let Richard do his thing. Thanks.